This is a production of Cornell University.
One of the wonderful things about working at Cornell University is the people you get to work with. And I've had a number of outstanding graduate students, and one of them is Dr. Chris Peters, and it's his work that I'm going to be presenting. I helped him. But with the approach that we've taken in this work is a modeling study or a whole series of modeling studies. The work started at Cornell University and was funded by USDA and later the Kellogg Foundation. And looking over a whole series of studies, what we wanted to do was determine how many persons could be fed a complete, balanced diet on land currently in use to grow food crops with sustainable methods. This would be in the United States. And how much land is needed to feed one person. The research and modeling team involved Dr. Chris Peters, who's now at Tufts University in the School of Nutrition Science and Policy, and a number of his graduate students have contributed to the latter part of this. Dr. Jennifer Wilkins was formerly at Cornell in food science. I now think she's in an endowed chair, but in any case, she's at Public Health and Food Studies and Nutrition at Syracuse University. Dr. Art Limbo is now at Salisbury University in the Science and Technology Department. He helped us with a lot of the interface with mapping and so forth. Dr. Nelson Bills was in AEM, is retired, and I'm now retired. So we kind of moved away from Cornell University. The background, the first, just notice that Chris Peters is the senior author in all the papers I put up here. This is not the complete list, but the other thing, they started publication in 2007, and out of this funding grant request, the last paper came out a year and a half ago. The studies I'm going to look at today are, first of all, looking at the New York State model, where we looked at the diet, what we called food prints and food sheds. We'll define those a little bit later, and the population that could be fed in New York State with our agricultural land. That study was funded by USDA. Kellogg Foundation became interested in the work that we were doing, and then funded us to compare New York State with Michigan, New Mexico, and Mississippi, and then to look at all 48 states. They picked out these 3 additional states because Kellogg Foundation is interested in childhood nutrition or malnutrition, and Michigan, and major studies going on in Detroit for inner city kids, in New Mexico on the Indian reservations, and in Mississippi, rural poor. And they said, we'll give you money to study all 48 adjacent states if you do these 3 next. And there's some interesting studies there. And then we went on to look at all 48 states to compare balanced diets relative to the populations that could be supported. How much food does it take? The information for most of this work is in published sources and with a lot of calculation. And if you weight the average size of an American, all sizes of people, all ages, all genders, all physiological states, according to the distribution, it takes 2,153 calories or kilocalories per person to balance the diet. And what kind of diet? We actually went back to the 1992 USDA food pyramid. My plate looks a whole lot different, but it doesn't show you this important information of how many servings you are, and you can get into the footnotes. It tells you how many cups of various kinds of food or what weight of food. So we actually could start here and work back to agricultural production with the information provided in the pyramid. What we put into the models, finally, the last one was 186 primary food commodities. Those are essentially crops in the USDA database about crop production in the United States. There are a lot more foods than that, but those are the primary commodities. And what is it? Corn shows up in 30% of the food in the supermarket right now. So there's some assumptions and manipulations going on here, but we're going back from these food commodities to agricultural commodities, or actually crop production. And then the USDA and other services have also told us what's the loss from the time it gets out of the field through storage, processing, cooking, all of this. What is the total loss? And again, it's information available for each one of those kinds of food. And you end up then with the weight of food that's consumed. And the interesting thing about this study, particularly when we started back in just after 2000, is we're linking agriculture and crop production to human nutrition in a pretty sophisticated way, using the data that is out there. So that was a cool thing. And I have not listed the crops, but they're categorized: all the grains, all the vegetables, the fruits, the dairy products, other protein crops, beans, lentils, and so forth, added fats, and sweeteners are the categories in the diet. And one of the statements that Chris made in the last paper I showed up there is that land, I almost wanted to say soil, is the foundational resource. It's not the only one. You could argue that water is going to be a limiting factor, or that climate is becoming a limiting factor, but we focused on the land factor in these studies. And how do you define sustainable land use? And this, I didn't come up with this, except when we were in our earlier discussions, I said, let's go back to the land use capability classes from NRCS, and this is how we'll define what is sustainable use. There are 8 classes of land. Class 1 land has only slight limitations to crop production. Class 2 land has only moderate limitations. Class 3, they say they're severe. And what's happening as you go down here to 1 through skip 5, 1 through 4, and then 6 and 7, generally the slope is increasing, so the land becomes more erosive. But there could be other limitations. So anyway, you get out here. Class 5 has a set of limitations that are not easily corrected. It's too shallow, too rocky, too wet, too steep. The growing season's too cold. As an aside, I was crossing, when I was a graduate student traveling from Nebraska to Davis in California, I stopped to gas up in the Great Basin, mountains all around with lots of snow, and I said, why is this in sagebrush? Why isn't it in irrigated agriculture? And the guy said, we get a frost 12 months of the year. Beautiful looking land, plenty of water around for irrigation, but it's going to be in class 5. You can't grow crops there. Anyway, you get down here. What are the management modifications on this? Well, if you get to class 2 land and you use conservation tillage, you can crop it every year, even though it has some slope. Or you can crop it only 3 out of 5 years in a crop rotation. The other 2 years, it needs to be in a sod crop, essentially a pasture, something you could graze. But you don't need to graze it, but it needs to be in the sod to protect it. And then you use conservation tillage on class 3 land, or put a sod on it 3 out of 5 years, or you can just use it a sod 2 out of the 5 years with conservation tillage. That's how you're reading my code up there. You get to class 4 land, you only can crop it once in every 5 years. And so forth. You get down here, class 6 land's only grazing, and so forth. The model data, we started out in New York, and I'll just show you this rather than going through those details. This is a map of land use in New York State. We're really interested in the agricultural use of the land, and it pulls out like this. New York State looks kind of funny here. The border of the state is actually down here, and they've extended the border to the American border next to Canada out into the lakes. But anyhow, that's where the agricultural land is in New York State. Here's Western New York, where there is a concentration of that land. So we plugged in the dietary information, the land data, and we then did the calculations, how many people could you feed, and we looked at different diets. The diets we looked at ran from this, this many calories. Well, wait a minute. I'm not going backwards. There we go. We had percent calories from fat. That influences how many people you can feed. And over here's the population you can feed with just the agricultural land in use, currently in use, that's current 2010, with different diets, with from 0 ounces to 6 ounces of meat in the diet. And the really interesting thing about this, the surprise, is that the vegetarian diet, no meat, as you increase the fat, you feed fewer people. Producing fat takes more land, more energy. It's photosynthetically not as efficient. You get right down to the physiology. And actually, you look at these numbers on a vegetarian diet versus these with 2 ounces of meat in the diet, you can actually feed more people with a little bit of meat using the New York State land base than you can on a vegetarian diet. That was a surprise to a lot of ecologists, and we had to explain what was going on there. The issue is that because of the nature of the land in New York State, you have all this unused land. And when you get back here to the 0 ounces or grams, a different scale right there. I didn't get the scale, changed it on my slides. I'm sorry. But anyway, you've got a lot of unused land. So you're feeding fewer people because you've got land you cannot use in a sustainable manner. It's just too steep. And as you increase the quantity of meat in the diet, you use more and more of the land with those perennial crops, grazing, beef cattle, sheep, dairy cattle on the steeper hills. And let's see, next slide. So how many people can we feed? If we're looking at, this is the 30% calorie that's in the middle of the table, not the extremes I was talking about earlier, we can feed almost 30% of the population of New York State in 2010 in a vegetarian diet. And this is in hectares. I'll show you in acres a little bit later on, but you see this is the unused land. So the land that you're using decreases as you go from 6 ounces of meat back to 0. 6 ounces is a lot. So here is the summary in the extension publication. Thank you for crediting me with some extension work. And we just, use this. You talk about what's your carbon footprint. Well, so what's your land footprint in terms of food production? And this is the 6 ounce diet. It takes 1.9 acres per person. You want to know the metric units there in the previous slide. And here's back here, 0 grams of meat in the diet takes half an acre per person. This fed the most people with the 2 ounces of meat. And that's equal to about the size of a deck of playing cards per day. Little more than 1 egg. And then this one with all that meat, that's 3/4 pounders. But there, you see, there's a huge impact on how much land it takes based on your diet. Very, very interesting work. The other thing we were able to do, because of the way the maps were coded for New York State, we could see where the food had to come from. And he developed the concept of the food shed. And this shows the area around major cities in New York that would feed all the people in that population center, well, all the people in the circle. And it turns out that for most of the cities in New York State, we actually have what amounts to a local food system that is potential. We're dealing only with foods produced in New York. What that means, there's no oranges and no bananas. You got to get your vitamin C from sauerkraut or something else or other sources. But that's one of the assumptions. So this is how it works out. And he developed an optimization procedure to go with the model. So he minimized the distance that food had to travel to feed everybody. And he come up with this interesting kind of map. And what you see, here's the population back, I've estimated, I think, 2005 for Buffalo and so forth. And this is the percent of the food needs you can meet. For Buffalo, Rochester, and Syracuse, you can virtually feed all the people with that local food system. And this is the distance that the food has to travel. And the average across the whole state, including New York and Poughkeepsie, is just 30 miles. But if you put New York City in there, the whole thing blows up. You can't really feed New York City. And what the local food sheds look like are not very local anymore because New York City, to minimize the miles, is robbing from the other cities, is what's going on here. So that was very interesting. We had a lot of local food sheds. We could feed about a third of the people in New York State with the land that is in New York State. We're always going to have to import food into New York State with our present populations. The next thing we did was to compare the states. And what I just showed you for New York State, we can feed about 1/3 of the people, doing the best we can, and that cows will actually increase the food supply because it allows us to use land in a sustainable way that we otherwise could not. When we go to Michigan, lots of agricultural land, no problems, nothing interesting there. They could just feed themselves about anything we did. Go to New Mexico, big surprise. They've got all this wasteland, all this rangeland, class 5 land in New Mexico. But every cow in the state reduced the food supply. What's going on? Cows have to be fed in the wintertime. The winter feed for cows comes from irrigated land, irrigated alfalfa for the most part. Every acre of irrigated alfalfa reduces other food crops that could have been on that land. So in this land configuration, every acre or every cow in the state actually decreased the amount of food they were producing. I don't know if the cowboys out there would like to hear that, but anyhow, that's what happens. When the cows compete for the land, you've got some problems. Okay, let's go back to or continue with our study of the 48 contiguous states, adjacent states. We're looking at this human dietary need, complete balanced diet. I showed you those numbers before. I was not involved in the study, but Chris and his graduate students actually developed a more sophisticated model than we had in the first one regarding livestock, a good livestock feed need model. There were still 186 different foods and feeds with the losses calculated, the land types and the areas now in production. This is all potential, no changes in population or land. And we wanted this sustainable cropping system, sustainable land use. And so what that looks like now is what I've showed you before, the 8 classes. We're saying this is our definition of sustainable. And with these conservation tillage or crop rotations, and then out here looking at the whole United States and subtracting the land used to grow cotton, tobacco, ornamentals, and so forth, you end up with 95 million hectares in food production in classes 1 and 2. Some of class 2 may be in forage crops. Actually, all of it could be if you're dedicated to cows. Then we have 39 million hectares that we call grazed cropland. That's in classes 3 and 4, where you need to have cover crops. You don't need to graze them, but they're there and you can. And so called that grazed cropland. We can grow some crops some of the time on these categories. And then you get down here, and from 5 to 7, really, we have 299 million hectares in permanent grazing land in the United States that are, as best we could figure out, being used to produce food. To get that again, this is really important looking at sustainable land use. We have 95 million hectares of cultivated cropland. If we're using conservation tillage, we're using conservation tillage, that's all of class 2. If not, some of class 2 will be down here in this category. There are 39 million hectares of grazed cropland. This is land we can grow crops on some of the time, but not all of the time. And then down here, classes 5 and 6, 299 million hectares of what amounts to rangeland. I should have put in some picture slides, but to show you what rangeland in New York State looks like. But as you get close to the Adirondack Mountains, you get shallow soils to limestone bedrock. And we don't usually talk about range in New York State. I've seen a lot of the Western range and it doesn't look any different, doesn't produce any different. One of the calculations that they did in the animal model is what is the production potential of all this land. And the average, based on how much meat they're producing, they didn't go out and measure the yield, was something less than 700 pounds per acre across that land. But you can use it. You can use it to grow beef or lamb. Then what we wanted to do in this study of the 48 adjacent states was to compare different diets. And I'll go over this several times, but this is the code. We have the baseline diet. That's the current way we're eating right now. USDA has the information. Then we have a positive control, the POS diet. That is, we get rid of the excesses in the diet. We're over-consuming calories, and we create a balanced diet, formulate a balanced diet that has the right amount of calories in it. And then we make further changes. We have an omnivorous diet that's 100% healthy, down to 20% healthy omnivorous. Then we look at ovo-lacto-vegetarian with eggs and milk, lacto-vegetarian with milk, and the vegan diet with no animal products at all. And we make those comparisons of how many people could we feed on those acres in the United States. So this actually looks at the 10 diets in detail. Right now, the average person in the United States is consuming 2844 kilocalories per day. And this is the animal protein and the vegetable protein and the calculation, how many acres it takes to feed that person that diet. Then you drop it down to the 2153, which was calculated an adequate diet, and only changes in the fat in the diet. This is still an excessive protein diet, according to nutritional standards. And that's why we go from the positive control, let's just stop overeating calories, to the balanced omnivorous diet, which now we're dropping the protein level to what the recommendations say we should be consuming in protein. And then we just add more, we start adding vegetarian components to the diet as we decrease the omnivorous components. And you can look at what's going on. And interestingly, the acres per person for these diets, if minimizing acres to feed one person is your definition of what is sustainable, the vegan diet's the most sustainable. And most people think, well, no, that's the obvious answer, but it's not. Here are the populations we actually can feed with those different diets, and this is the percent of the U.S. cropland that is used. And you see, the vegan diet feeds fewer people than the lacto-vegetarian diet. This was the best one in terms of feeding number of people because it's using less land. The land sustainability kicking in. If you're not going to have animals in your system, what are you going to do with those forages? You plow them down. Hopefully that'll increase the yields, which was not calculated. But anyhow, this diet, the lacto-vegetarian, this is 261% of the 2010 population of the United States. Population in the United States right now, what is that? 325, 326 million. So all of the diets, we have a land base in the United States that provides more food than we need. Maybe that's part of the reason why we're overeating. We've got a food industry that advertises eat more, because we've got it to sell. That's not the only factor. I just like to eat. But anyhow, these are the numbers of people that we can feed. The land area required, and again, it takes the least land area for the vegan diet, but it doesn't feed as many people. how are we using that cropland? We have 95 million hectares of cropland that we could crop. And in this baseline diet, we're only using 71 million hectares of it. Not the the baseline diet. Because we have so much livestock and we're producing livestock feed and so forth. For the perennial cropland, the unused cropland, and this is all the cropland, lands where we can cultivate, that we can plow. And we're using all of it in these diets, but when we get down here, because of the conservation requirement on the class 3 and 4 land, less and less can be used as we're providing more and more vegetable products into the diet. And you can also see in that 299 million acres of rangeland or grazing land, when you get down here, just 40% of the 100% omnivorous diet, the fraction of that land we're using starts dropping. And we get down here to the vegetarian diets and the vegan diet, we're not using any of the rangeland in the United States. Now, I've put these numbers in red because the question comes up, and looking at the validity of this somewhat theoretical, we're using published data, but are all the assumptions what they should be? What if we could use this unused cropland for different crops? That maybe is a clue to how to increase the food supply in developing new crops. But as a modeler, let's just change the numbers with sensitivity analysis and see what happens. Is it possible to grow food crops on the unused perennial cropland? That would be classes 3 and 4 for the most part. That is, more tree crops, more nuts, more apples, and so forth in our diet. Things that we could put on fairly steep land, whatever they would be. And how does this affect the rankings? And the analysis, it's a sensitivity analysis, and you can look at everything. But anyway, the vegan diet became equal to the ovo lacto and the lacto-vegetarian diet if we could put 92% of that class 3 and 4 land into crops every year. Right now, the baseline, NRCS is only 71% is there. So what is needed to move that way is to have crops that we can put on that marginal steep land that produce food in a perennial way. Move toward getting perennial cereal crops and so forth. Might help. And of course, research is going on in that area. So, concluding comments. Got a lot of time to talk about this. First of all, the diet has a big influence in how many people that we can feed. This is known, but this is giving quantitative information on that particular factor. The vegetarian and vegan diets do take the least amount of land. If you're concerned about carbon sequestration in wild land, if wild places for wild animals to live and so forth, a vegan diet's good for them. But sustainable use of land now in production will provide feed for livestock that will produce meat and milk in the diet. So actually more people can be fed with modest amounts of animal products in the diet. Just looking at that study in New Mexico, I think that's an interesting point. Livestock can compete with food crops for the use of cropland. And so that will reduce the food supply where that happens. If you have a land resource such as we have in New York State or Michigan, I didn't look in detail, where we have enough marginal steep land that we can feed our livestock, adjusting out what their ration is, then animals are going to increase the food supply. The local food sheds, the local food sheds, This is a recent study. I just showed you New York City blows the thing up, and I've been saying for years as I talk about this, I don't have any idea how we're going to feed New York City, how we're going to feed Los Angeles and Tokyo and Mexico City, thinking about a local food system. Urban agriculture will make a significant contribution, but they're still going to have to import food. And Chris and his graduate students have looked at other cities on the coast. And if you're only halfway surrounded by agricultural land, or worse than that, by mountains and rocks like New York City, a local food system is not going to be possible. We're going to have to continue to import food into those big coastal cities or get people out there. Don't know if you want to think about that. The sensitivity analysis shows that the use of the cropland pasture changes the results on the ranking. We're assuming what is sustainable land use, so that we've got 39 million hectares of cropland in the United States, the 48 states, that have to have a lot of forages on them for sustainable use. If that could change, that would change the comparison of the different diets, and vegan diet would become more acceptable. The last thing, let me see, this is being recorded. I have to be careful how I say this. But some proponents of the vegan diet are very suspicious about the results. In fact, they were almost livid. I've never done any work that has brought so much response from the public as this particular work, because people advocating vegan diets just were sure that it would feed the most people. And they didn't like the idea that that was not the most sustainable method you could use. I don't know how you want to define sustainability. Certainly the vegan diet used the least land, but it had a lot of unused land that affected the results. So this is where I want to stop, and I've given myself too much time for questions. But I think you get the idea of what we have been doing. And I think it's pretty interesting. It was nice to have Chris Peters here as my graduate student and then postdoc. And his work, I think, has set up his whole career. He's getting grants, publishing lots of papers, continuing to work on the modeling of food systems. And he's gotten tenure. Yeah. Yes.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.